Hey guys, Tyler Berger here with BassFishingHQ, and today I want to talk about fall bass fishing. Fall bass fishing can be some of the best fishing you will experience all year long. And the best thing about it is most fishermen are in the woods hunting right now. So you're going to have the lake to yourself, and not only that, once you find these fish, they're really grouped up. So you can catch a lot of bass and you can catch big bass. Some of the biggest bass of the year that have been suspended out in the middle of the lake are now pushing up and feeding up for the fall, and you can take advantage of that and catch numbers of bass and big bass. So stay tuned. We're going to go from the beginning of the fall transition to the end and go over everything that you need to know about fall time bass fishing. So the first part of fall fishing is that summer to fall transition. And to be honest, this is one of the most difficult times of the entire year to catch a bass. And the reason is that during this summer to fall transition, you have what is called the fall turnover. Now, what do I mean by fall turnover? This is basically where the bottom layer of the lake actually flips with the top layer and they mix together. So you might be asking, what do you mean by the bottom layer flips with the top layer? Let me explain. During the summer, your lake is going to stratify. That basically means it's going to separate into three main parts. Those parts include top layer, the thermocline, and the bottom layer. Now these different layers of water actually have really scientific names, but I'm not going to say what those are because I don't even know how to pronounce them. But basically all that is important to know is that the top layer near the surface is a warmer layer that has a lot of oxygen in it. The thermocline, which is sandwiched between the top layer and the bottom layer, is basically the prime area for you to catch bass. This zone has the most oxygen in it, and you're going to find a lot of life in this zone. Below the thermocline, you have a cooler layer, which is basically dead. This zone has very little oxygen, and it's very difficult for certain types of fish to live in this environment. During the fall, as you have cooler nights, the top layer is going to start dropping in temperature, while the bottom layer is going to remain basically the same. As the top layer continues to drop and actually gets to be the same temperature as the bottom layer, your thermocline will be dissolved and the three different zones of water will all mix together. And this is the fall turnover. The reason that this is bad is because it takes the oxygen that was in that top layer of water and the thermocline and basically spreads it out into the entire lake. So this will deplete a lot of oxygen, and therefore the bass are going to be fairly lethargic. They become lethargic because it requires oxygen in order for bass to chase bait and eat it, and they simply can't afford to expend a lot of energy and a lot of oxygen during this time. You will typically know when the fall turnover is happening because as that bottom layer of water starts to mix with the top layer, the whole lake is going to turn a little bit off color. It will actually kind of be a darker bluish color, and sometimes it will actually even smell. You will also find that during the fall turnover, you will see typically some sort of fish kill. And so if you see a lot of fish floating and you see a little bit weirder color water, this is a good indication that the fall turnover is happening. So during the fall turnover, one of the best places to find bass is actually running up the major creeks and rivers that are feeding into your lake. I have found that it can be extremely difficult to catch bass offshore during this time, again because the oxygen has been depleted in a lot of the lake, and because of that the bass are just not active on the main lake. But if you run up into the river, sometimes you're going to find flowing water, and a lot of times with flowing water you're going to have more oxygen created, and that's going to not only draw bass, but it's going to draw bait fish. If you guys remember a few years ago, John Cox was fishing in the FLW Cup in later August or September, and the lake was fishing pretty terribly. So he decided to run way up a creek, about as far as you could go, and he found a huge group of bass in really shallow water that were eating bluegill, and he was able to catch them on things like frogs and flipping, and it just looked like a ball of fun. And so again, during the fall turnover, one of the best places to find bass is way up the river. And again, you're not only going to find bass there, but the reason that you're going to have bass there, not just the oxygen, is that there's a ton of bait in those areas. And that is one of the main things that you always want to look at anytime you're fishing in the fall. In the fall, it is all about bait. It is all about shad, bluegill, crawfish. The bass are feeding heavily during the fall to try to feed up for the winter. They don't want to eat as much during the winter because their metabolism is going to slow. They won't actually need to eat as much in general. So they are really trying to feed up before the winter. So their life during the fall is basically derived around the bait. So going up the river, you're going to be able to find a lot of bait and you're going to be able to find a lot of bass. Before we get any further into the video, please go down and click the subscribe button to help this channel grow. And if you like this content so far, hit the like button. The turnover is typically going to last a couple of weeks, but after that, as the water continues to cool, the whole lake is going to come into play, and the bass are really going to start feeding heavily in order to get fat and healthy for the winter. So one of the best areas to look for bass during the fall is what I call guts. Guts or corrals or funnels. These are basically areas where bass can push bait fish and pin them so that they are able to feed on them heavily. The best thing about a gut is that it blocks bait fish from escaping on 3 different sides. So if the bass push bait into this area, they can block it off and they can feed heavily while having to move a lot less. Now, guts can be made from things like grass lines, but it also can be made from hard structures as well. One of the best places to find a gut is in between 2 points on the main lake. If you think about it, 2 points that rise up really high on each side will form a perfect gut in between. Again, these are areas bass can push bait fish and feed heavily on them without many bait fish escaping. Another place you will find a gut is even if you just have 1 point. On each side of the point, you're going to have an inside turn, and these inside turns work as guts. And these are areas where, again, you're going to find bait fish that are pushed in by bass, and the bass are feeding heavily on them. The big factor with guts is that not all guts are going to have bass. Again, the #1 key to finding fall bass is bait. So if you find bait inside of one of these guts, you're going to find bass. So keep that in mind when you're fishing. Another place to find fall bass is in grass. Now, the biggest thing about grass during the fall is that as water temperatures continue to cool, a lot of grass is going to die. It'll turn a brownish, reddish color, and a lot of bait fish and bass are going to move out of it. So the key to finding bass in the grass during the fall is to find the greenest, healthiest, crispiest grass that you can find. The best thing about finding grass bass during the fall is that typically you have a vast amount of area that all has dying grass, and you will have a small area where the grass is still green and crispy. Now all the bass that were in that huge vast area are going to move to this small area. And sometimes you can find a giant school of bass in a very small grass patch, which can make bass fishing phenomenal. Again though, you have to remember that even if you find healthy grass, if it has no bait in it, more than likely you may not find bass in it. The good thing is though, if you find green, healthy grass, more than likely you're going to have bait, and more than likely you're going to have bass. So again, as the water cools down, really concentrate your efforts on that healthy green grass. So as the water really starts to cool and the water temperature is in the 60s and even in the 50s, you're going to find a lot of shad and other bait fish in the back of creeks. Now this is a great place to find fall bass as well. The bass are going to be pushing bait fish into the back of these creeks, and like a gut, the back of a creek creates a place where bait fish can't escape from bass. And so a lot of times you're going to find a massive amount of bait fish and a lot of bass in a small area in the back of a creek. Now, the best thing about this too is you can really use some power techniques to catch these fish. You can use buzz baits and square bill crankbaits. You can even flip bushes that are near the back of the creek, and it can really be a lot of fun to catch bass during this time. Again, one of the biggest things that you want to remember is not all back of creeks are going to have bass in them. So again, look for those backs of creeks that have bait fish. If you have bait fish, then it's time to start fishing. As you start getting into late fall, the water temperature is going to be in the low 50s and even upper 40s. And as that happens, a lot of bait fish are going to start exiting out of the main creeks and head for the main river channel. The bass are going to follow these bait fish as they move from the backs of creeks back out to the main lake. One of the best places to catch bass during this time is on creek channel banks. This is very similar in that you can find a large amount of fish in a very small area if you find the right creek channel swing. What I mean by a creek channel swing is an area in a creek where the main creek that used to be there actually runs right alongside the bank. This creates a fairly steep bank, and this is where you're going to find bass. Fishing these areas can be fairly simple. I typically like to use a tube or a jig in this scenario, and I like to stay off the bank a ways and cast my bait to the bank, and then I'm going to slowly hop my jig or my tube all the way down that creek channel. Sometimes you will find that the bass are still fairly shallow on creek channel banks, and other times you're going to find that bass are relating to brush piles or logs or laydowns that are actually in maybe 10, 15, 20 feet of water on these creek channel swings. So again, as the bass are exiting out of creeks, they're going to use these creek channel swings as their highway to the main lake. So as the lake really gets into the mid to low 40s, most of the bass are going to be located out on the main lake as they follow bait fish out there. And that's going to start the winter time. And we'll get into the wintertime bass fishing at a different video. But again, I want you guys to remember that the biggest key into fall fishing is bait fish. If you find the bait fish, there's going to be bass close by. Guys, I hope you liked this video. If you did, hit the thumbs up button below and subscribe to the channel for more awesome content. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments, and I'll see you guys in the next video.